Okay, good morning, everyone. We are on Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph. Zak the Mishnah. Yayin nesech aser ve'aser b'chol shehu. Yayin b'yayin u'mayim b'mayim b'kol shehu. Yayin b'mayim u'mayim b'yayin b'nosein tam. Zeh aklal min b'mino b'mashu v'shalom b'mino b'nosein tam. So the Mishnah says that yayin nesech is aser, as we know, and it's oser b'kol shehu. Now at this point, as we'll see, and this is how we'll start with, and this is how we'll end with, but in the middle we'll have a little bit of a different possibility. We say that yayin nesech oser b'chol shehu means you have a bore of regular wine, and yayin nesech falls into the bore. So a little bit of yayin nesech, one drop, will ruin all of the wine in the bore. If it's yayin falling into a bore of yayin, or it's mayim, what's mayim? Rashi says there could be such thing as mayim nesech, where you poured water to avodah zarah. So if that falls into a bore of mayim, then it's oser b'kol shehu. One drop of water into a bore of kosher water, one drop of wine into a bore of kosher wine, everything is aser. However, if you have yayin nesech that falls into kosher water, or you have mayim nesech that falls into kosher yayin, then you have to have enough yayin that's falling in that's going to change the tam of the water, or enough water that's falling in that's going to, change the tam of the yayin and ruin the tam.
So a drop is not enough.
So a drop would not be enough if it's not min b'mino. This is how we go paskin halacha l'maisa by kashrus. Right. If you have a little bit of treif that falls into treif chicken soup that falls into chicken soup, it's going to be aser b'mashahu. And if you have milk that falls into chicken soup, if you have treif that falls into aser mashahu, if you have milk that falls in, so then according to this it'll be 1/60th, no same time, which we say since we can't necessarily measure the taste, so Chazal tells us it's 1/60th. But again, the Mishnah, the Pashup shot is that you have aser stuff falling into heter stuff. And as soon as one drop of aser falls into the heter, unless it's something that's not min b'mino, but a regular case of min b'mino, the yayin into yayin, or mayim into mayim, it's going to be oser the entire bore. Kiyasa Rav Dimi Yam Rabbi Yochanan Zak the Gemara. We're going to have three opinions on what Rabbi Yochanan says. The first two are going to change what we just said, and the third opinion will go back to what we just said. Kiyasa Rav Dimi Yam Rabbi Yochanan Hame'ara Yayin Nesech Mechavis Labor. If you pour yayin nesech from a barrel into a bore of yayin kasher, Afilu kol hayom kulo rishon batel. Not like our Mishnah. The entire day, if you do that, every drop that you pour of yayin nesech into the bore of yayin kasher, when it hits the bore, what happens to the yayin nesech? It's batel in the yayin kasher, and therefore it will not, in fact, change the entire bore into yayin nesech. Tanan, that's not like our Mishnah. Yayin nesech aser ve'oser b'kol shehu. My love, our Mishnah, the way that we described it, the kanafel isura legavater, is not that you have yayin nesech falling into hetera. Now, again, the difference why we can make this assumption or why we can reject this is because our Mishnah never says, like Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan clearly says, Rabbi Yochanan clearly says, you're pouring yayin nesech into yayin kasher. Our Mishnah can be read like that, the way that I read it, but it says nowhere in our Mishnah specifically that you're pouring yayin nesech into yayin kasher. We assume that that's what it's talking about, but you can also read our Mishnah as saying that you're pouring yayin kasher into yayin nesech, and that's not going to be so much of a chiddush. It's much more of a chiddush to say one drop of yayin nesech is going to ruin the entire bore of yayin kasher. To say that one drop of yayin kasher will be batel in yayin nesech and become aser, that's not a chiddush. That's exactly what we would think. So the Gemara says, "Lo de kanafil hatera lagavi surah." That's what our Mishnah means according to this. Einachanami, if you would pour a drop of yayin nesech into a bore of kosher wine, it would not be a problem. It would not be a problem. It'll be batel in the kosher wine. That's what I just said, that if you pour, that's what he just came along and said. What's our Mishnah talking about? Where is it a problem? It's a problem when you're pouring the heter into the isser, then the heter becomes batel in the isser and becomes like the isser. Tashma, the problem is, yayin b'mayim b'nosein tam. The second part of the Mishnah seems to be saying that if yayin falls in mayim, then it can ruin it b'nosein tam, which seems to be that if there's enough yayin nesech that falls into kosher mayim, it's not going to ruin it right away, but if enough yayin nesech falls in that it changes the taste of the mayim kosher water, it's going to be a problem, not like you're saying. According to you, a little drop, what's the problem? Says the Gemara, my lav de kanafil chamer de isura lemaya de hetera, and you just said that when chamer de isura, even if it's no same time, every single drop should what? Every single drop should be batel right away. Says the Gemara, lo de kanafil chamer de hetera lemaya de isura. Again, we're dealing with chamer de hetera. You have good yayin that's falling into bad water, and the good yayin is becoming bad, not that the bad yayin is making the good water bad. Says the Gemara, this is this opinion. The problem is that if you're explaining now the Reisha, you're explaining the Reisha as what? yayin b'mayim being good wine into bad mayim. Right? That's how you just explained it. Good wine into bad mayim, and the good wine becomes bad. But now the Sefer says, mayim b'yayin b'nosein tam, that if water falls into yayin, then it's b'nosein tam. But you're just talking about bad water, good wine into bad water. So now if we're talking about mayim in the Mishnah being bad water, then we have to assume that in the Sefer, mayim is also bad water. Right. But now you have bad water falling into good wine, and saying it's going to be mevatelet, but no Saint Tom. But you just told me that when bad falls into good, the good gets rid of the bad. Says Amar L'cha Rav Dimi, no. Don't tell me that it all has to be the same type of water. It's all the same situation where you have good falling into bad. But in Echanami, in the first case, it's good yayin falling into bad water, and in the second case, it's good. It's bad. It's bad yayin. It's good yayin. What? It's bad yayin falling into good water. Kula masnisa hatera lagavi surah. 1 second. Veresha de kanafel chamer de hatera lamayadi surah. In the Resha, it's good wine falling into bad mayim. Again, read into our Mishnah. Yayin b'mayim b'nosein tam. That's when you have what? When you have good yayin into bad mayim, then as long as there's no Saint Tom, unless as soon as there's no Saint Tom, then the mayim is going to ruin the yayin. Unless there's no Saint Tom of the yayin. Seifa de kanafil mayadeter l'chamer disura. And in the Sefer, you have mayadeter that falls into chamer disura. When mayadeter falls into chamer disura, it'll also ruin it. So again, it's coming out the way that we're learning now, and then I'll take the question. It's coming out the way that we're learning now, according to Rav Dimi Amar Rabbi Yochanan. The Mishnah is not like we thought. We originally learned the Mishnah saying 1 drop of bad wine will ruin the entire thing. Rav Dimi says no. 1 drop of bad will be batel in the whole bore of 1 drop of bad will be batel in the whole bore of good. Just like 1 drop of good will be batel in the whole bore of bad. Where do things start to get a little shady, or where do they start to change? If you would pour an entire thing, because we're talking about drops, if you pour an entire thing of bad into the good at once, it doesn't say exactly how much, but an entire bottle of bad into the good at once, then it might cause a problem. But if you're just doing drop by drop, it's not going to cause a problem. Each one is batel.
I'm just confused about one thing.
Yeah.
Mayim that goes into the yayin, it has its own tam. That's what they're saying.
No, so that's where it gets confusing, because it sounds like the no Saint Tom again. The way we're learning the Mishnah, the way that we learned the Mishnah originally, the way that we learned the Mishnah was mayim b'yayim b'no Saint Tom means that the mayim, which is treif mayim, b'yayin, it has no right b'no Saint Tom. That means that the treif yayin mayim will not cause the yayin to be bad unless b'no Saint Tom, unless it changes. It sounds like unless it dilutes unless it dilutes enough the change of the yayin where the yayin no longer tastes like yayin. That's what it sounds like. It doesn't actually have a taste, but it can dilute the yayin to the point where it removes the taste. That's where it's a little bit complicated. When you're dealing with, usually when you're talking about yayin into mayim, it tastes like yayin. It sounds, again, Rashi doesn't say it, but the way I understood it is that mayim into yayin, when we're talking about the usher mayim going into yayin, it'll only be a problem once you dilute it.
Can't be drops.
But that's exactly why it's saying mayim in. That's exactly why it's saying mayim into yayin will be okay until it's no Saint Tom. The question that the Rishonim will deal with is, let's say it doesn't happen at once. Right. Eventually, if you put 1 drop in at a time, so you're going to tell me each one is going to be batel, but there's going to come a point where even though each one was batel, the entire thing will no longer taste like yayin. That's where the Rishonim will talk about, well, if it was batel, then who cares after the fact? Or after the fact now that they've each one been batel, but after the fact when now it tastes like the mayim, or it's removed the taste of the yayin, that's where it gets complicated. But that's why I wanted to keep it simple, where we're talking about drops. Probably and again, what?
Probably vinegar by then.
It probably is just, no. It's just watery wine. It's just wine without taste. But again, that was our Mishnah, which we're going to get back to in a second. We assumed that it was yayin nesach into good wine or into good water. But at this point, Rav Dimi is learning, we're learning the opposite, that a drop of yayin nesach will not ruin regular wine, a drop of mayim nesach will not ruin regular mayim, and our Mishnah is talking about when the good is falling into the bad, and there it's not a matter of ruining. It's just the mitzvah is that when you have good into bad, every single drop of good is going to be batel. That's the first way of learning. Kiyasa Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef Rabbi Yochanan, he adds one other caveat. Hame'are yayin nesach meitzirtzur katan lebor afilu kol yom kulo rishon batel v'dafka tzirtzur katan delo nafesh amudeh. He seems to be working off of the last opinion that we just had, and he's just clarifying that this whole discussion of the yayin nesach not ruining the yayin heter, which we said that each time it drops in it's going to be batel, that's only when you're pouring from from something with a small spout. But if it's dealing with a big spout, which is what I again alluded to, where if you're dropping a lot in at a time, then you can start causing problems, and you can say that even yayin nesach will ruin the yayin heter on the bottom. So those are the first two opinions, which seem to be again next to each other. But the bottom line is that those two first opinions hold that yayin nesach can in fact be batel if you pour drops of yayin nesach into a whole container of yayin kosher. Each drop of yayin nesach can be batel. The way that we learned the Mishnah is really the third opportunity, or the third opinion. Kiyasa Rab and Amr Rabbi Yochanan. This is real lumdus here. The third opinion, really the first two are very connected, so it's really the second opinion, the way that we originally learned our Mishnah. However, he says it in a weird way. Yayin nesach shenafal abor. If you have yayin nesach that falls into a bor, v'nafal sham kiton shel yayin, shel mayim, and water also falls into the bor. Rowan et heter ki'iluei. No, this is important because we're going to have this again. You look at the heter, what's that? The kosher wine is if it's not there. V'hasha'ar, the yayin nesach, is mayim rabin alav mevavadlo. So listen to where Rabbi Yochanan comes. Comes to the Beis Medrash and makes an announcement. You have a bor of kosher wine. If yayin nesach would fall into that bor of kosher wine, even one drop, what would happen to that kosher wine? Gone. Not the way we just learned, the way that we originally learned the Mishnah. The way that we originally learned the Mishnah. Because the other two people are also going to learn our Mishnah, they're just going to learn it differently. They're going to learn yayin b'yayin means heter into isser. So, the way that we seem to hold. So what does he say? He says, Einachanami, yayin nesach, a drop into a bor of yayin kosher, even one drop ruins it. Not like the other two opinions just said. But he adds one kula. He says, V'nafal sham kiton shamayim, and we'll see exactly when it falls in. What he's saying is what's happening here, as we'll see in a second. Let's just read the next opinion because he clarifies. He clarifies Rabbi Amar Yochanan. He says as following. Rabbi Yochanan said something else. Lo shanu el shenafal kiton shamayim tchila. This is a complicated Gemara today. But here's what we're talking about. Comes along Rabin, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, and says, like we originally learned on Mishnah today, Yayin b'yayin, mayim b'mayim b'kol shehu. You have a whole bor of kosher yayin, and one drop of yayin nesach falls in, everything's gone. However, I'm going to give you a kula. If when you have the kosher yayin, and this is a fascinating kula, when you have the kosher yayin in there, before the yayin nesach falls in, what happens? Some water falls in. Now when the yayin nesach falls in, kosher water, now when the yayin nesach falls in, there's two ways to look at it, as we'll see on the next daf as well. One way to look at it, which is not the way that Rabbi Amar Yochanan is looking at it, is one can look at the water that just fell in as what? As being batel to the yayin. Now you still have a whole big thing of yayin kosher, you just have a little bit more yayin kosher. When the yayin nesach falls in, what happens? It trafes up the entire thing. The way that he's looking at it, which is a fascinating chiddush, is what's happening. You have yayin kasher, some mayim falls in. When the yayin nesach falls in now, even though when you look at it in Mitzias, it looks like you just have one big vat of kasher yayin, in halacha, we imagine as if the mayim is separate from the kasher yayin. When the drop of yayin nesach drops in, where is it dropping into? It's dropping into the mayim. It's being mevatel min b'she'eno mino. It's being mevatel b'kol shehu. It's being mevatel yayin nesach. And now the entire thing is going to be kosher. That's his chiddush. But what we also see from here is that when it's all yayin and a piece of yayin nesach falls in, then it's going to be trace. The only saving grace here is that the mayim that fell in, which is then clarified as being mayim that fell in before the yayin nesach. This won't work the other way. He's clearly saying that if you have a thing of wine and yayin nesach falls in and then water falls in, even though on the next daf we're going to see there's actually an opinion that holds that even that would work. But over there, according to this, it's too late. So that's what he holds. It says the Gemara.
It's not going to be mean mishamina if it's diluted more than 1/6 with the wine.
But we're not assuming it's one. We're not assuming it's a ketone. That's why it's a ketone shamayim. If it was more than a ketone, if it was a lot of water,
because otherwise you no longer have wine.
If it was a lot of water, then you would no longer have wine, and then it would be correct. Correct. One can argue that. No, but no.
Yeah, it wouldn't be min b'shmino.
It doesn't matter. If it's not min b'mino, then you have even more of a kula.
That's what I'm saying. It would be even better.
Then it would be even more than a drop. Then you could have even more. Then you could have up to 1/60th.
Exactly.
But if you have enough, yeah, but then you're not going to be happy because then your wine's not going to taste too good.
Okay, it's not good.
That's why it's a ketone. I don't think a ketone so much. That's why you basically have three different sizes. You have the kol shehu of yayin nesach. You have a drop of yayin nesach, a ketone of mayim, which is a little bit bigger. Therefore, the ketone of mayim can be mevatel the yayin nesach, and a whole bor of yayin kosher, which could then be basically mevatel everything, and the whole thing becomes yayin kosher.
Modern wine all has water. These ancient wines had zero water in there.
No, but they used to mix it to drink it.
No, but here in this case.
But it doesn't matter, because even modern wine, where we're mixing water into it, so that would be more of a reason to be mekel.
Yes.
That would be more of a reason to be mekel, because if yayin nesach fell in, and we're going to have that case on the next page, on the next daf, where we're going to talk about where somebody mixed wine with water, and then truma fell in. So had you not mixed it with water, it would be gone. But now that you've mixed it with water, we could say that if you hold like this svara, then the water part can be mevatel, the truma.
Just technically,
Yeah.
I gotta find it problematic.
Okay, take it up with, 1 second. Rabbi Huda Nasi's phone number. You can email Rabbi Huda Nasi. It's ryn@gmail.com. If it bounces back, then I can't help you. He might not answer on Erev Yantiv.
There's probably somebody RYN somewhere with gmail.com.
I can only tell you that. I think no. It's spelled differently. Ketone is with a taf, not with a tet. Yeah.
Which size is it?
That's what I'm saying. I think it's bigger than a drop, but smaller than a large amount. Just enough to be mevatel the yayin nesach.
Why does the water move out to the wine, Rabbi?
That's what he's saying. Because what do you mean?
That's the kula that he talks about?
It's a kula, but it's not. I mean, it's only a kula because it's happening inside of yayin kosher. The fact that it would be mevatel the yayin nesach in general is not a problem. If you just had a cup of water and a drop of yayin nesach falls in, that's not a kula that it's going to be mevatel it. The kula is that it's being mevatel, even though it's quote unquote in front of us mixed already with the yayin kosher. But that's his kula. But again, either way, you see that our Mishnah now, we learn the original way, that according to this opinion, even a drop of yayin nesach into regular wine will ruin it. And the only saving grace here is that you have the mayim. Zog the Gemara. Ika demasni la masnishan. There are those who learn Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Shmuel, Rabbi Yochanan, about having mayim on our Mishnah. Yayin b'yayin koshu, Amar Shmuel bar Yehuda, Rabbi Yochanan, lo shanu ela shelo nafal sham kiton shal mayim. That even in our Mishnah, when you say that yayin b'yayin, a drop, again, within this third opinion, we're talking about our Mishnah back to the original way we understood it, a drop of yayin nesach in yayin kosher, lo shanu ela shel nofal shal kiton shamayim. That's only going to be if a kiton shamayim did not fall into the yayin kosher. However, aval nofal shal kiton shamayim roan es ha'eter ki'ilu eino v'ashar mayim rabban alav v'vatlan oso. It means there are those some who learn this kula of applying to our Mishnah as well. What's the nafkamina? It would be the same exact thing. We just said that he's applying this to a kula where you have yayin nesach that falls into regular yayin. Lamaisa, you're going to be mekel. Says Gemara, Ma'ika bein d'lamasni la masin shemein d'lamasni la d'Rabban. What's the difference if you learn it on our Mishnah, or you learn it on Rabban? Rabban is explaining our Mishnah. It's the same exact thing. He says no, it's even more of a kula if you learn it on our Mishnah. Ma d'masni la masnisan lo ba'it chila, ma d'masni la d'Rabban ba'it chila. So the Gemara is in essence, I'll just say it outside. Rabban came along and said, here's the following rule. The rule is that if you have yayin nesach that falls into a bore and mayim falls in, then lemaisa the mayim can go ahead and can be mevatel the yayin nesach, right? Comes along Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yochanan or Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda Rabbi Yochanan, and it says that's only if the yayin, it's only if the water fell in first. Clearly, he's talking about what? If he's clarifying an opinion of somebody who spoke about water, he's clearly talking about it needs to be dafka where the water fell in first. If you just learn his opinion where he says where the water, again, all he says is shenafla kiton shamayim tchila. If he goes ahead and he's coming on the Mishnah, so now the Gemara is saying maybe you can learn that he's not saying tchila, he's just coming on the Mishnah, which doesn't talk about mayim at all. Again, you have Reb Shmuel bar Yehuda Rabbi Yochanan who's coming and saying something about water. That's how the Gemara is basically learning. He's coming to say something about water. Wait a second, he hears a halacha. Wait a second, water will change the halacha. If he's coming to the opinion that we just said, Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, if he comes on the opinion of Rabban already in his halacha in the Beis Medrash said that there's this halacha of yayin nesach falling into yayin, and there's also a detail of mayim that's involved. If he comes along to the Beis Medrash and says, wait, I want to tell you something about mayim, he's clearly clarifying something that Rabban already said. He must be coming to say that this mayim that you're talking about needs to fall in first. Right. But if we're talking about our Mishnah, where they were talking in the Beis Medrash and they said, if yayin nesach falls into yayin, it's aser. If mayim nesach falls into mayim, it's aser. And he comes along, well, let's forget about the mayim nesach. I don't want to confuse. If yayin nesach falls into yayin, it's aser. And comes along Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, Rabbi Yochanan says, wait, I want to tell you something about water. If he's coming on the Mishnah's case, where nobody was talking about water, it's possible to suggest that he's going to be even more makil and say this whole thing will work even if what? Even if the water falls in after the fact. That's what the Gemara is suggesting. That's what the Gemara is suggesting. The Gemara is saying that after the Gemara is suggesting. It doesn't explain why. But that's the whole point over here. So now, Correct. It was minimino. You would think that it would be batalit. The Gemara is suggesting. Correct. That's what the Gemara is suggesting. Again, there's where we're stuck with. That's where we're left with. So we're going to start with Idmar, which is going to be a work off of this. But just to, again, frame everything that we've said until now. We have our Mishnah that says Yayin. Let's just concentrate on Yayin. Yayin b'Yayin is Aser. We have different ways of learning that. The first two ways, which are really one and the same, basically, we're saying our Mishnah, when it says Yayin b'Yayin is Aser, is Dafka talking about what? Kosher wine into Aser wine will be Aser, because the kosher wine will be Mavatal in the Aser wine. But in a Chanami, had it been a drop of Yayin Nesech into Yayin Kasher, it would not be Aser, the whole thing, unless you have enough, etc. That was the first opinion. Then we say we're not really learning like that. Really, we're learning our Mishnah the way that we originally learned it. Yayin b'Yayin means if you have a drop of Yayin Nesech, this is how we paskin, if you have a drop of Yayin Nesech that falls into Yayin Kasher, even one drop of Yayin Nesech will ruin the entire thing. That's where we ended up. Then we had a caveat and said that what? There is a kula that if in fact there's water in there, we're not sure whether it has to be, it makes more sense to me like you're saying, that it has to be beforehand. So let's just assume like that. If in fact there was water that mixed with the Yayin Kasher, a ketone of mine that fell in before the Yayin Nesech fell in, then in fact it would be okay. And it could be extending it to what Rabbi Black was saying, that if you want to make sure that you're never going to have a problem with the Yayin Nesech, then what you could do, lechatchila, is seemingly you could take your Yayin Kasher, mix some water into it, and that'll prevent, or that'll protect it in case Yayin Nesech ever drops in, unless it's a significant amount, which in case you can't do anything, but this way it'll protect it, that in case some drops of Yayin Nesech fall in, you'll have this kula to say that the Mayim Shabo is protecting it. That's what we spoke about. Okay, let's do a little bit more. Itmar. Yayin Nesech shenafal avor v'nafal sham kiton shamayim. This is what we were just saying. Amar Chizkiya, now the only problem is now we have to make it more complicated. Now we're going to have a machlokes between Chizkiya and Rabbi Yochanan if this really works. Amar Chizkiya, higdilo be'isser aser. So we were just taking it for granted that again, the mayim falls in, let's assume first. The mayim falls in first. So we assume that according to this opinion in our Mishnah, if mayim falls in first, then it can be mevatel the yayin nesach that then falls in. Comes along Chizkiya and says, I don't really agree with that. Amar Chizkiya, higdilo be'isser aser. If the Yayin Nesech falls in last, it's actually Aser. Because Chizkiya says that what happens, he holds the way that I explained before. He holds that you have Yayin Kasher, water falls in. What happens to that water? It becomes Yayin Kasher as well. When the Yayin Nesech falls in, it ruins the entire thing. That's Chizkiya. So he's arguing on everything we just said. Higdilo beheter mutter. However, if you have what? The water, and then the Yayin Nesech falls in. So what happens to the Yayin Nesech when it falls into the water? It becomes batal in the water. Then the Yayin Heter falls in last. Then we can go ahead and say it's okay. So according to him, again, if the Yayin Nesech falls in last, then we're going to have a problem because then you have wine, kosher wine, with the Yayin Nesech that ruins it. If in fact the Yayin Nesech falls in first into the water, then, or whether it falls in first or second, the water is going to be mevatel, and then the Yayin Kasher. Rabbi Yochanan amar filu igdilo be'isser mutter. Rabbi Yochanan says, like we were just saying, that what? Even if the Yayin Nesech falls in last, it's mutter because when it falls in, we view it as if it's falling into the Mayim part and not into the Yayin part. That's Chizkiya Rabbi Yochanan. So in case we're not confused enough, we're going to try to bring in another case and try to compare these cases. Now I'm just giving you the prelude. We're going to reject this comparison. But the Gemara wants to suggest that this comparison, that this mechlokes is Chizkiya and Rabbi Yochanan, that if the Yayin Nesech falls in last, according to Chizkiya, it will ruin the entire thing because the water was already batel in the Yayin Kasher, and therefore it's the equivalent of having Yayin Nesach into Yayin Kasher. It's going to ruin everything. According to Rabbi Yochanan, no, you could still view the water as being separate from the Yayin Kasher and being mevatel Yayin Nesach. We're going to compare it to another case, which we're going to reject, but let's just see what the Gemara suggests as a comparison. The Gemara brings another case. The case here is where you have dough. You have dough of chulin, which is, you want to make into bread. Now, you have yeast, seor, which is yeast. And that's what the Gemara Torah says. We can't have chametz, and we can't have yeast either. So the seor, you have two types of seor. You have a seor of chulin, which is mutter, to make bread, and you have a seor of truma, which will make the bread into truma. The problem is you don't have enough of either one. If you mix the two of them together into this bread, it'll rise and it'll be perfect bread. But neither one of them by itself will be enough. So the question is, does the whole thing become truma because half of the yeast is truma? Or do we say that since the truma yeast by itself was not enough to make the bread rise, we're going to be mevatel the truma yeast, and you can actually eat the entire bread? Says the Gemara, or shachulin v'shal truma v'shanaflu l'tocha isa. 50% of the yeast is chulin, 50% is truma, which is aser, and they fell into dough, which is chulin, which is mutter. Lo bazekadei lachametz, lo bazekadei lachametz. Neither one by itself has the ability to make this bread rise. V'nitztarfu v'chamsu. So this case is Rabbi Lezer Omer, acher on aniba. You go based on the last thing that falls in. If the truma falls in last, then we're going to count this bread as being truma. Why? Because the 50% of yeast that fell in first, that was chula, and it couldn't rise the bread, it couldn't make the bread rise by itself. But now that it's in there, when the truma falls in, what happens? It can finish the process, and it looks at it as if the last thing that fell in. Who is that like? That's like chizkiah. That the last thing that falls in what? The last thing that falls in, when we say when the yayin nesach falls in last, what do? We treat the entire thing like yayin nesach. When the truma falls in last, again, the Gemara is going to reject this comparison because the cases are not really similar. But at this point, the Gemara is suggesting that just like when the truma yeast falls in last, we treat the entire thing like truma. That's Rabbi Eliezer who says that that's Chizkiah who says that when the yayin nesach falls in last to this mixture of water and yayin kasher, it's going to answer the entire thing. The Chachamim say no. Bein shenafal iser betchila bein basof. It doesn't matter if the Isser falls in first or it falls in last. It doesn't matter when the Truma falls in. It doesn't matter if the Yayin Nesach falls in first or it falls in last, which is Rabbi Yochanan's opinion. Even if the Yayin Nesach falls in last, it's still going to be Mevatel. Why? Because the Truma by itself is not going to be able to make the thing Chametz. And so too, the Yayin Nesach over there, a different svara, but the Yayin Nesach, when it falls in, if the water's in there, the water will be able to be Mevatel the Yayin Nesach. So according to the Chachamim, you'd be able to drink the wine and you'd be able to eat this bread because the truma is gone. The truma is batel. Says the Gemara, "V'tizbra, is it really a good comparison?" V'amar Abaye, lo shanu ela shekadam v'silei kesa iser, aval lo kadam v'silei kesa iser aser. Gemara says you can't make the comparison because we learn that Rabbi Eliezer over here who says that what? Rabbi Eliezer says what? Rabbi Eliezer says that if the truma falls in last, it's aser. Rabbi Lezer says that if the truma didn't fall in last, that if the truma yeast falls in first, and then what? And then the kosher yeast falls in, then everyone would agree, like in the case of yayin. Seemingly, he would agree what? He would agree that it's going to be mutter. Problem is that we clarify that over there when he says it's mutter, lo shanu el shekadam v'silei kesa iser. He has a caveat and says it's only going to be mutter if you take out the 50% of yeast that's truma before the 50% yeast of chulin falls in. But if you don't take out the 50% yeast of truma that fell in first, even if the 50% yeast of chulin fell in afterwards, it's going to be aser. Now that's not like anybody. Chizkiah de Amar Kaman. Then it's not going to rise. It's not going to rise. It's not going to rise. But Chizkiah de Amar Kaman. Then Chizkiah says like nobody, because Chizkiah seemed to have implied that it's only a problem if the Yayin Nesach falls in last, but if the Yayin Nesach would fall in first, then he would say what? That the water is Mevatel it, and now when the Yayin Heter falls in, there's no problem. He doesn't say you need to take out the Yayin Nesach out of the water, which would be impossible to do. He doesn't say you need to remove the water. He said as long as the Yayin Nesach falls in first, it's not a problem. But over here you're trying to make the comparison, and over here you clearly see that Rabbi Lezer, you're trying to match up with Chizkiah, he holds that even when the Yisr falls in first, it's not going to be okay unless you remove the Yisr. So Chizkiah and Rabbi Lezer don't really get along with each other, which is what you thought. Chizkiah Damar, come on, Elahacha berowan kemiflgi, LeChizkiah leslei rowan Rabbi Yochanan islei. Rather, we're going to throw out this comparison, like I said. Forget about the comparison of the dough. The dough is a whole different thing. It's different factors involved. It's not going to rise by itself. It'll rise by itself. It'll be vatal. Let's throw that out. So let's go back to our discussion now. What are they arguing about in Mitzius? It means let's go back to Yain. Forget about this or for a second. Now we have this machlokes again, just the chazer again. This machlokes by wine. Chizkiah says if the Yayin Netzach falls in last, that means if you have Yayin Heter and you have water, so the water falls into Yayin Heter, the Yayin Heter falls into the water, the whole thing becomes Yayin because there's a lot of Yayin and only a little bit of water. When the Yayin Netzach falls in, it ruins everything. Says Rabbi Yochanan, no. That even if the Yayin Netzach falls in last, it doesn't matter because what? We could look at it as if the Yayin Netzach is falling into the water and the water can be mevatel the Yayin Netzach. And for sure, if the Yayin Netzach falls in before the Yayin Heter, then for sure the water is going to be mevatel it. Right? So Rabbi Yochanan said you're always going to be able to drink it, and Chizkiah said you won't be able to drink it in the case of the Yayin Netzach falls in last. What are they arguing about? So the Gemara says they're arguing berowan kemiflgi. LeChizkiah lesle rowan, LeRabbi Yochanan isle rowan. What does it mean, rowan and not rowan? So Rashi says on the left, we'll just read one Rashi. The left, like 10 lines down, uver rowan kemiflgi. Savar Rabbi Chizkiah says, Lo amrinan, roin esmino ki'ilu eino, v'she'eino mino rabba alav mevala. What does it mean that we don't say roin? In order for this to work, in order for this yayin esach, again, what's the case? You have water, you have yayin heter, water falls in, and then yayin esach falls in. In order for it to work and not become a problem, like Rabbi Yochanan says, what do you have to have? You have to look at it, roin. You have to say roin. We look as if the mayim is separate from the yayin heter, and the mayim is mevatel the yayin esach. Like we said, that's what roin means. That according to Rabbi Yochanan, you'd have to say roin es ha heter kimisha eno. You take, even though in Metzius it's not true, you take the yayin heter and you look at it as if it's separate, and then comes along the mayim and is mevatel the yayin esach. So Rabbi Yochanan will say that. Chizkiah will say lo roin. When we have the mixture of water and yayin kasher, lo roin, we don't look at it as if the yayin heter is separate from the mayim, and if we don't look at it as being separate and we look at it as being one group, then when the yayin esach falls in, it's not falling into the water, it's falling into the entire mixture of yayin, which is going to make it a problem. Understood? Is that glot? Is that clear? Is it not clear? If it's not clear, then we can't go on. It's clear? Okay. So that's the difference between them. Again, Chizkiah would say, they all agree that if you have mayim and yayin, nesach falls into mayim, that the mayim is mevatelit. The only thing they're arguing about is when you have yayin heter and mayim in a bor, and then yayin nesach falls in. Chizkiah says, in that case, we don't say roin, we can't separate the two. Therefore, the mayim and the yayin heter is really one unit of yayin heter. When a drop of yayin nesach falls in, it ruins the entire thing. That's Chizkiah. As opposed to Rabbi Yochanan, who says, roin es a heter kimisha eno. When you have the water and the yayin heter, you can separate the two. When the yayin nesach falls in, you could say it's falling into the water and not into the yayin heter, and therefore the entire thing will be mutter. So Rabbi Yochanan is more makil than Chizkiah. Let's just move on, because we're running out of time. Says the Gemara, umi islay le Rabbi Yochanan roin. Does Rabbi Yochanan really say that we could be roin? Again, roin means that we could separate the two. Does he really say that we can separate the mayim heter from the yayin heter, and therefore say that the yayin nesach is falling into the mayim heter and not into the yayin heter, because in the mayim heter it'll be mevatel, and the yayin heter it'll ruin it? Does he really say that? V'haba minei Rav Asi mi Rabbi Yochanan, shnei kosas, this is the case that the rabbi was talking about before. Shnei kosas, if you have 2 cups of wine, undiluted, echad shel chulin ve'echad shel truma. Now, if you mix the truma into the chulin, of course, even one drop's going to ruin it. But what do you do here? Mazgan. You mix each one individually with water. So now you have a cup of truma wine with water and a cup of chulin wine with water. V'irvan zeh. Then you pour them all into one thing. So had you not mixed them with anything, you just poured the truma and the chulin into one thing, everybody would agree, aser. The question is now, when you mix the 2 of them with the water, according to Chizkiah, it's still aser. Because you have, assuming that you poured in the other wine first, it's still aser because the yayin nesach is the truma is coming and ruining it. Ein roin. But according to Rabbi Yochanan, it'll be mutter because now when you pour in the truma, you could look at it as if the truma is going into the water of the yayin kasher, the chulin, and the rest is it. So they asked him, what's halach? And he didn't answer. So they want to assume the fact that he didn't answer, he doesn't really hold roin. Says the Gemara, no, that's not why he didn't answer. Says the Gemara, v'lo mahu, v'lo pashale, he didn't answer. Meikar lo pashale, he wasn't in the mood to answer that day. Libaso pashale, but at the end he answered and said it would be okay because you have the mayim there and you could be rowing as if it's not there. Idmar nami rami amirachon v'amalam mirasi amirachon beikotzo lechot shel chulin v'echot shel truma mazim v'irvan zebezeh rona said to gileino v'ashar mayim rabin alav mevatlin so. Perfect. So that's the whole beautiful thing here. Let's spend 5 more minutes. This is easier Gemara. Ze'aklal min b'mino b'mashu shelo b'mino b'not Saint Tom. What do we say in our Mishnah? We said in our Mishnah, when you have yayin nesach, the way that we ended up learning at the end, forget about mayim, don't take any of these other things into the kulas into account. Bottom line is, most simple case, you have a thing of yayin heter, yayin nesach falls in, it ruins it b'mashihu. If you had a thing of mayim, and yayin nesach fell in, then you would have until it's enough yayin that's going to change the tam. Then we said at the end of that Mishnah, which we're talking about yayin, zehaklal, min b'mino is a mashahu. Min b'she'eno mino is no same time /160. So Gemara wants to know, what is zehaklal including? When you give me one rule by yayin nesach and you say zehaklal, it's including other things. So one suggestion is going to be it's including all other isurin in the Torah. Anytime you have an isur in the Torah, min b'mino is going to be b'mashu, min b'she'eno mino is going to be b'no same time. And according to the second opinion, no, it's only including one separate case, tevel. Says the Gemara. Amar Rav Shmuel Damri Tavayu. Kol Isurin Shabbat Torah. They have the same halacha as yayin. B'minan b'mashu shelo b'minan b'nosei tam. Zeh klal asuye mai. According to this, what's zeh klal including? Asuye kol isurin Shabbat Torah. It gives the example of yayin, and then it says zeh klal. This klal of min b'mino b'mashu, min b'sheino mino, with 1/60th. That's by every single isur in the Torah. But this is just one example. Rav Yochanan Reish Lakish Damri Tavayu. Kol isurin Shabbat Torah bein b'minan bein shelo b'minan b'nosei tam. They're more makil. They say in general every other isur in the Torah except for yayin, actually you have to have 1/60th, and less than 1/60th will not be a problem. If that's true, chutz mi tevel v'yayin nesach, except for yayin nesach, which is in our Mishnah, and one other case which is tevel. If you have tevel, and that means truma wasn't taken off. If you have tevel and it mixes with kosher grain, it's going to ruin it even a tiny amount. Says the Gemara, b'minan b'mashu v'shelo b'minan b'nosein tam. Tiny amount if it's tevel, if it's grain into grain, and if it's grain into wheat or something, then it's going to be b'nosein tam. Zeh klal, then lasuye mai. So zeh klal is lasuye tevel. So you give the example by yayin, and then we included two tevel to say the same thing by tevel, but not by every other issur, because according to this opinion, it's not true by every other issur. By every other issur, we're going to be more makil, and it's only going to be a problem when it's more than 1/60th. Says the Gemara, Tani kavasi de Rabbi Shmuel, Tani kavasi de Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish, Tani kavasi de Rabbi Shmuel, Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah b'minan b'mashu shelo b'minan b'nosein tam, Tani kavasi de Rabbi Yochanan v'Reish Lakish, Kol Yisurin Shabbat Torah b'minan shelo b'minan b'nosein tam, chutz mi tevel v'yayin nesach b'minan b'mashu shelo b'minan b'nosein tam. So we're just going to end by saying Bishlam al yayin nesach mishum chumra davaros kochavim elatel of tevel my timer. If you say that it's the same halacha by all isurim in the Torah, then you don't have to explain yourself. It gave the example of yayin nesach, but this rule applies everywhere. In general, min b'mino is b'nosein tam, min b'mino is b'mashu, and min b'sheino mino is b'nosein tam. But the way that you're learning now, that it's only by two things. It's by yayin nesach and by tevel. So the svara by yayin nesach, I understand why we should be machmir there, that if it's min b'mino, it should be even b'mashu, because yayin nesach is avodah zarah. But why by tevel, if a little bit of tevel falls into a pile, if a tevel grain falls into another pile of grain, why should a mashu of wheat ruin the entire other thing of good wheat? Says the Gemara, elamai time at tevel. So the Gemara says something fascinating. Katero kachisuro. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You want to have the kula of a heter, you have to have the chumrah of a chumrah. What does that mean? The Amar Shmuel chita achas poteres esakri. When you have a whole pile of tevel means before truma was taken off. How much truma do you have to take off that pile? You have a whole pile of grain. How much truma you need to take off to potter it from truma? So the Rabbanan say, depends what type of guy you are. If you're a good guy, if you have a lot of money, 1/40th. Beinoni is 1/50th or 1/60th. Says Rashi, that's only Midei Rabbanan. What does the pasuk say? Reishis tegancha. How much you have to take off from truma? If you take off one tiny grain, midaraisa, you're yotzei the entire thing. You made it no longer tevel. So since we're going to give you the kula when you want to make tevel mutter, we're going to give you the kula of taking off one little grain. We're going to hit you the other way as well. Then when it comes to making it usher, if one drop of tevel falls into a whole thing of pressure, the same grain, that was going to done. It's going to ruin the entire thing, which is a fascinating thing. So again, midrabanan 1/40th, 1/50th, 1/60th. Careful what you wish for. So that's what the Gemara is saying. Says the Gemara, "B'tanya nami hachi b'mei amru tevel iser b'kolshu b'mino shelo b'mino b'nosein tam." We're still going to have the kula that when it's shelo b'mino. So then, just like by yayin nesach, we're not going to be more machmir than yayin nesach. Yayin nesach by mayim or a chita, a thing of tevel chita that falls into saora, into barley, then it'll be 1/60th. But min b'mino, according to this opinion, min b'mino is going to be a chumrah specifically by yayin nesach and tevel, not by anything else. By everything else, it'll have to be 1/60th, whether it's min b'mino or min b'she'eno mino. Specifically by yayin nesach, we're going to say min b'mino is going to be b'mashu, by yayin nesach because it's avodah zara, and by chita, by tevel, because we're going to give you the kulas that a tiny bit can poter the entire thing, but then that same tiny bit is going to be able to ruin the entire thing.